Hi, quick note from future me, or will be past me by the time you're listening to this, but more current than the rest of this recording because this episode was actually recorded in August of 2023, which was almost 2 years ago. And I've been sitting on it for a while. I did at some point publish it, but I am releasing it again with this little note at the beginning because I didn't want to just put it to waste. I did spend some time re-researching this episode, and while the science has not changed, I have. So this episode's very much Frankenstein because I was still learning how to edit. I still am, but yeah, I just wanted to throw in that quick note at the beginning of this that this was literally 20-year-old me talking, trying her best to communicate scientific research in a succinct and compelling-ish way. So, yeah, and also there is a slight factual, actually not slight, it is a completely factual error at the beginning. It has nothing to do with science. So I'm going to be leaving it in because I think it's very befitting that it happened in an episode all about how terrible our memory is. So without further ado, here's the very first episode of On My Nerves that I ever recorded.
Hello, hello, and welcome to On My Nerves, the podcast that's all about science and our modern society. I'm your host, Olivia Pilson, and I'm a neuroscience student who has far too many questions about the world. For the first episode of On My Nerves, I thought I'd discuss one of the first studies I ever read that made me want to study neuroscience. And I will be linking the study in the show notes as well. And as the title suggests, this episode is all about erasing memories. For those thinking that this sounds a little bit too much like science fiction or a movie, I can assure you that this research is definitely real and still ongoing. Now, something that both neuroscientists and psychologists can agree upon is that memory is extremely complex. In fact, most agree that our memory is far from perfect. Just think about how you might be able to quickly recall the meeting you had with your boss last week, but maybe not so easily remember what you had for lunch yesterday. Or you might be able to vividly remember watching the 1937 film The Wizard of Oz for the first time when you were 4 and dressed up in the witch costume you wore the previous Halloween, but might not so easily remember the books you read in middle school. And yes, those two stories were specific to me. But why is memory so difficult to study? Well, for one thing, our memory is unique to us, and our brains are pretty selective about what actually gets stored. In most Psych 101 classes, memory is simply defined as the way our brains encode, store, and retrieve information. And while that isn't incorrect, it just doesn't give us the full picture. The truth of the matter is that we don't have all the information on how or why our brains store and retrieve memories just yet. Although we like to compare our brains to computers, our memory is not nearly as pristine as we'd think it is, or like to believe it is. With that being said, something our brains can do far better than a computer is store an infinite amount of information indefinitely. There's no limit to how much our brains can store or for how long we can store it. Which personally I think is just the coolest superpower ever, being able to learn and remember an infinite amount of things. Now, are you going to remember every single thing? No, but that's okay. And if you were thinking, isn't that just what long-term memory is? Well, then you're correct. But as I mentioned earlier, our memories are far from perfect, and sometimes our memories can fade with time. But I'd be willing to bet most of us can still recall a few things from when we were pretty young. Once again, thinking back to my example of when I first watched The Wizard of Oz. Now, this isn't one of my earliest memories, but it is an odd one to recall over 15 years later, considering it's just watching a movie. In fact, I think most Americans do this on the weekly. Although this was long before the days of streaming. This was back in 2007 when I watched it on a VHS tape that my family had. But even after our brains go through what information to save versus what to ignore, it's not the same thing as pulling up a file on a computer. There are plenty of reasons why our account of a situation might not line up with what happened. Sometimes we have gaps in our recollection, sometimes we can be influenced by information we learn later, or vice versa, we might be influenced by information we already have. We could also be influenced by our emotional state and our personal perspective. And that last one is pretty common. There are tons of shortcuts our brains take every day without us even realizing it. And a lot of times this is to make it easier for ourselves. This can happen on a large scale too. Every few years, the concept of the Mandela effect resurfaces in popularity on social media. For those of you that haven't heard of it, the Mandela effect is essentially when a large group of people collectively misremember an event or concept. And this can be something like a song lyric or a logo. For example, I think a popular debate was whether or not the Monopoly man had a monocle for some reason. Actually, to this day, still don't remember myself. I know a couple ones were also some famous movie quotes. But the flaws in our cognition that our brains frequently fall victim to is a lot to unpack right now, so I won't be. The take-home message is that our brains have the ability to remember a lot of information for an indefinite amount of time, but our memory is not always accurate. For the rest of this episode, I'll be discussing how science might be able to take advantage of how we remember specific types of emotional memories. For many people, when they try to recall something, they're able to tie a sensory or emotional element to it. For example, you might remember hearing the sound of your coworker's voice when you were discussing office gossip last week. Or you might be able to visualize what the drive home from the grocery store looks like. You might even be able to smell and taste your aunt's famous mac and cheese. Or maybe you remember the feeling of a Razor scooter flying into your ankle. And I'm very sorry to everyone who I just reminded of that painful experience, that last one. And if you have no idea what a Razor scooter flying into your ankle feels like, then you're lucky. And if you didn't wince at that last statement, I'd be willing to bet that the thought of that pain probably just put a sour taste in your mouth. Because for those who have experienced a Razor scooter flying into your ankle, that pain that you felt was a sensory and emotional experience. Now, I didn't just include that last example just for fun. The sensory and emotional aspect of pain might help us to actually study memory. Remember how I said that we're still learning how our brains are able to store and remember information? Well, let's just say what I'm about to discuss doesn't really clear any of that up. So far, I've mostly talked about the limits of our memory and how we feel or what we experience when recalling our memories. But what's actually going on inside your brain when this happens? Is remembering information as observable as watching an athlete run a marathon? Can we even see or identify when a memory is formed? Can we see where it's formed? Well, the short answer is yes, and the long answer is, you guessed it, it's complicated. The billions of neurons that make up your brain form trillions of connections. And yes, I just said trillion with a T as in tango. Trillions. And when you learn new information, the neurons in your brain form even more connections. But it is possible to break these connections as well. The connections in our brain are maintained by a variety of molecules, including a vast number of proteins. And this is definitely not new information. We've known for decades that the synaptic connections in our brains can be disrupted by inhibiting the proteins that maintain and build them. And about 60 years ago, there were two popular competing theories on the neural basis of storing and remembering information. The first theory is known as the consolidation theory of memory. This theory followed a more traditional school of thought and outlined that a memory was stored one time in the brain. Almost like if you plucked a file out of a filing cabinet within your brain every time you remembered something. But the second theory is known as the reconsolidation hypothesis. This theory challenges the former by proposing that the brain encodes a memory every time you recall it. So in other words, your brain rebuilds this memory every time you have to remember it. This would be like if your brain pulled a memory out of a filing cabinet, but tried to redraw it and then store that reproduction instead of the original every single time you remembered something. But the frustrating thing is that it's very difficult to test either hypothesis. And the research that has been done has mostly supported the first theory. So for many decades, the consolidation theory was treated as the quote-unquote more accurate theory for how we store and retrieve information. That was until the early 2000s, when Dr. Nader, who at the time was working at a postdoc at NYU in Dr. Joe Ledoux's lab, proposed a modified brain behavior model in order to test if the reconsolidation hypothesis still had any weight to it. Dr. Nader at the time was investigating to see if it was possible to disrupt memories that were already created. This method is now known as post-retrieval manipulation of memory. And Dr. Nader was able to study this by using a couple of animal models. And the way he did this was by playing some sort of tone, like a beep, for a rat, and then shocking it a few seconds later. And just a quick little disclaimer, these shocks were not enough to actually cause harm to any of the animals. And this was done over and over until the rat was able to associate the beep with the incoming shock. We know that the rat constructed an associative memory between the beep and the shock because after a certain number of tones played, the rat would freeze before the shock in order to prepare itself. For one trial, after the associative memory was established, Dr. Nader played the beep but administered a drug that was thought to have memory erasing capabilities before shocking the rat. Then, 2 months later, Dr. Nader played the same tone again for the rat and shocked it, but this time the rat didn't freeze. And this was still true after consecutive beeps were played and shocks were administered 60 days later. So even after going through the process of creating a painful associative memory, all of that had been forgotten 60 days later with the administration of just one drug. But in order to test the validity of the study and make sure that the drug administered 60 days prior wasn't causing brain damage and erasing all the memories, Dr. Nader actually carried out a similar second experiment. This time, there were 2 distinct tones that were played at different times, and after each one of them, the same shock was administered. After many trials of alternating between tones, the same drug used in the first experiment was then administered before a shock. However, this time it was only administered after one of the tones. And about a month later, a similar outcome occurred. When the tone that played before the drug treatment was administered, the rat did not freeze before the shock. However, the rat did freeze when the tone that did not receive the drug treatment was played. In other words, the rat had remembered that the second tone came before a shock, but had completely forgotten that the first tone also came with that same shock. Now, Dr. Nader's intent behind these experiments was to see if the mechanisms of retrieving emotional memories could be manipulated for therapeutic purposes. And this is important because if only the consolidation theory of memory were true, then the window of opportunity for treating trauma disorders is very narrow. But if Dr. Nader's work on the reconsolidation hypothesis held up, then treatment could be administered well after the traumatic event. And in the late 2000s, this hypothesis was actually tested on humans. And in these trials, patients suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, were given a pill during therapy sessions in which they talked about their trauma with a clinical psychologist. Now, let me just set 2 things straight real quick. These patients' memories were not erased. They could still remember what happened, but their emotions connected to these memories were made a little bit hazy, making it less painful to talk about. So in a lot of the literature, it says that their memories were essentially eroded as opposed to being erased, which is a more accurate description of it. But eroded is not quite as catchy. Also, this type of therapy is only used experimentally and is not in general practice today. So don't think you can just go and request your doctor for this sort of thing, because it's not something that's conventionally used. A few drugs have actually been used for clinical trials, one of them being metirapone, which I've also heard pronounced as metirapone. And I believe that this is the drug that was used here. But again, there are others, and I'll be talking about them in a couple minutes. But this is not the only thing that this drug is used for. Metirapone is also used to assess the function of adrenal glands for different diagnoses. And those are the glands that are located above your kidneys, and they're really important in releasing cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone. To me, what really blows my mind about all this work is how it threw a wrench into what we already knew about memory and how it works. However, it is worth noting that it did cause a bit of panic and a lot of speculation, both by other scientists and by the press. The panic that arose was a little bit similar to the panic around AI in early 2023, although not nearly as prominent. And fortunately, it wasn't everywhere, on every platform, all the time. An NBC article titled "Pill Could Erase Painful Memories" study shows, published back in 2011, as well as a couple of other articles, including a BBC article titled "Memories Can Be Erased Manually," published in 2014, both akin this research to a number of movies. One that comes to mind for me is a Jim Carrey film that I won't be naming here that used near-perfect memory-altering technology. But shocker, they're not nearly as accurate as they are depicted in film. But a number of other articles were also published by other psychologists and bioethicists, claiming that even if it was possible to erase memories, we probably shouldn't be tampering with them. And some of these arguments were actually included in an article written by Dr. Doux, whose lab a lot of this research was conducted in. And this article was published back in 2022. I will link it in the show notes. It's actually a really interesting read. I highly recommend you check it out. It basically just describes Dr. Doux' accounts of how everything went down and how he originally didn't want the study to be done because he didn't think that the reconstructive hypothesis was still viable. Like I said, I will link it in the show notes, and I definitely recommend reading it. It's a very quick, maybe 3-minute read. But this kind of leads into the next big issue, and that is speculation. A big downfall of the entire scientific community is how fast our brains can think up an idea or a solution, but can't actually execute it because of how slow the scientific process is. Basically, we like to think of the application before we even have a solution. So while this drug might be helpful in medical practice, right now there is no miracle drug. And while it's important to have these conversations and it's important to think about the ethics of the situation, all these things are coming before we even know if there's an end to the tunnel. Even looking at more recent research from the 2010s, we're still pretty far from finding a solution. An article that was published back in 2017 by Columbia University's Irvine Medical Center attempted to isolate specific proteins that were thought to strengthen neural connections while remembering specific traumatic memories. And in this article, they actually used a really great example to illustrate their point of what memories they're trying to isolate. The example they used, not in research, but in the article, involved removing the trauma of a victim who was mugged in a dark alley. And the goal was to eliminate the quote-unquote problematic, non-associative memories around the experience and the anxiety over what happened, without removing the information that would be important in the future. So basically, their goal was to eliminate the fear and anxiety around the experience, but also leave the lesson that was learned intact. So they were trying to eliminate the fear and anxiety around alleys at night, but leave the information of don't walk down a dark alley at night intact. But I should also specify that this was not how they tested this research, and this research was actually conducted in snails and not humans, because neuroscientists love their invertebrates, whether it's snails or C. elegans or fruit flies. And in this article, the authors of this paper also go on to say that the research is merely evidence that this principle may exist, but still further research needs to be done. A few other studies in recent years have also cropped up, attempting to test the effects of specific drugs on the memory of PTSD patients. One of these drugs includes propranolol. And if this drug sounds a bit familiar, it might be because it's a well-studied beta blocker. Beta blockers are usually prescribed for cardiovascular problems. Now in the US, carvedilol and metoprolol are more commonly prescribed for cardiovascular problems. However, propranolol, which again is the drug that we're going to be talking about more, is still sometimes used for anxiety and still sometimes used for cardiovascular problems here too. And as previously slightly mentioned, it is quite common to actually repurpose drugs because it's substantially cheaper to test a drug that we already know is safe in humans for another use. Propranolol was already known as a safe beta blocker that can be used in humans. And an American study from 2018 that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry concluded that propranolol could be used as an effective treatment for PTSD. But like most research, this also needed to be replicated. And in fact, it was. A later article published in Nature in 2021 and conducted in France concluded that propranolol could be effective for PTSD and for major depressive disorder comorbidities, which basically just means that someone is diagnosed with more than one disorder. However, they also stated in this article that there was not a significant difference between the experimental group and the placebo. So again, they were just alluding to it might be possible, but it's not likely. And this research that was published in Nature was actually conducted in France and does directly reference that they're challenging the American study from 2018. And both of these cases are excellent examples as to why we need to challenge not only old research, but also old theories. Because sometimes when we do, not only do new methods, but also new understandings emerge. The comeback of the reconsolidation theory recontextualizes our understanding of how our memories can evolve with us over time and can change how we learn new information. What you know today impacts how you think of your past self. And while I was revisiting this more recent take on memory, it kind of gave me a ship of Theseus vibe. Because if your brain completely rebuilds a memory every time you remember it, can it ever be considered the same as the original? And is it even comparable to how you felt and what you experienced as the memory was being created? And for those of you that are still worried about the science fiction applications of this research, don't be. Science isn't quite as fast as your imagination. Even to get to where we are now took decades. That's all for the first episode of On My Nerves. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that this topic and research was able to provide a new insight into your thoughts on memory. I'll link the segment that inspired me to write this, as well as the research that I discussed in the show notes below. If you liked this episode, please consider leaving a review or checking out the podcast's Instagram at AllMyNervesPod. If you have any comments or questions, you can also reach out there. Check back next week for another episode of On My Nerves.